Hello, thanks for spending some more time with me. In the last lecture, we talked about the Torah, the first of the three divisions in the Tanakh. And in this lecture, we'll cover the last two of those three divisions, the prophets and the writings. There's a tremendous variety of material here, from histories of ancient Israel to prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, from wisdom literature such as Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, to charming narratives like Ruth and Esther, to philosophical disputations that we might see in Job, and ancient hymns in the Psalms. If you're familiar with these writings, you may wonder what I could possibly say in a half-hour lecture that would do them justice. I've been worried about this myself, but keep in mind that the same problem applies to most of the lectures in this course. Here, in this lecture, we're only discussing 34 documents that take up about 600 pages or so. By contrast, our half-hour lecture on the Buddhist Mahayana Sutras in Lecture 16 will have to cover 627 texts comprising some 13,000 pages, and that's only if we count those in the Chinese canon. But back to the prophets and the writings of Judaism. Regardless of your religious background, you already know some of what's in these texts because they constitute one of the foundations of Western culture. So there are stories such as Joshua and the walls of Jericho, Samson and Delilah, David and Goliath, Daniel in the lion's den, and Jonah in the whale, as well as familiar sayings like, "To everything there's a season," or "turning swords into plowshares," and "pride goes before the fall." Well, actually, except for that last one. Proverbs actually says, "Pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before the fall," but it gets shortened in popular usage to "pride goes before the fall." And perhaps this just goes to show that it may be worthwhile to read these texts yourself rather than simply relying on paraphrases or common assumptions about them. For instance, you may be a bit surprised at how gritty or earthy some of these writings are. Much of the Hebrew Bible is inspiring and uplifting, yet there are also enough stories of murder and rape and warfare and destruction to get a solid R rating for a movie version. These 34 books include erotic love poetry, fierce denunciations of the wealthy and powerful, and even expressions of bitter skepticism, religious skepticism. And those are the sorts of things that sometimes get skipped over in Sunday school. At the center of all this is the God of Israel, a being who can be terrifying and unpredictable, and yet is nevertheless devoted to his people Israel and to all of humankind. I mentioned earlier that the Hebrew Bible is similar to, but not identical to, the Christian Old Testament. Christians have a few extra books, at least in the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions, since their versions were originally derived from the Greek Septuagint rather than the Hebrew Masoretic text. In the 4th century, however, there was a turn toward Hebrew by Catholics when Jerome used the Hebrew manuscripts wherever he could for his Latin translation called the Vulgate. Orthodox Christians have continued to use the Septuagint. Orthodox Christians are the Greek-speaking Christians of Eastern Orthodox tradition, and they have a few more books than even the Catholics do, such as 1st Esdras and 3rd Maccabees. Another noticeable difference is in the arrangement of the books. The Torah ends with Moses on the plains of Moab giving his last words to the Israelites before they move into the Promised Land. In Christian Bibles, the Torah is followed by a series of historical books. Those include Joshua through Esther, or 2nd Maccabees if you're Catholic, and then a section of poetical and wisdom books, that's Job and Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, plus a couple more for Catholics, and then it ends with the prophets from Isaiah to Malachi. In the Tanakh, in the Jewish scriptures, the order is a little bit different. The book of Joshua still follows the Torah, but it's regarded as the first book of the former prophets. It's Joshua through Kings. Next comes the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, plus the 12 minor prophets, and then the writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, the 5 scrolls, which are the Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther, and then finally it concludes with Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. The Christian ordering puts emphasis on genres, right? So you get history books, then poetry, then prophecy. But the Jewish arrangement makes more sense in terms of the canonization of these particular documents. As we've seen, the writings were the last books to be accepted as canonical, and some of the writings were among the last books to be written. Okay, so that's the basic roadmap, and let's start our tour, following the arrangement in the Tanakh. The prophets begin with Joshua and what appears to be, at first glance, a strikingly successful conquest of the Promised Land by the Israelites. In the next book, in Judges, however, we discover that the Israelites are not well organized, and there's a lot of fighting going on still, with other ethnic groups still left in the land, and there's even conflict between different tribes of Israel. This is an era that's memorably described as a time when there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. In general, not a happy time. The books of Samuel and Kings narrate the rise and fall of the monarchy, starting with Saul, and then moving on to David, and then his son Solomon, who was famous for his wisdom and for building the temple in Jerusalem. The United Kingdom lasts only 3 generations, and after the death of Solomon, the Israelites split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Israel has a tumultuous history, full of coups and assassinations, as different families vie for power, and then in 722 BCE, Israel is conquered by the Assyrians. And the deportation of that population gives rise to legends later on about the lost 10 tribes. The Israelites up in the north seem to have assimilated or disappeared into the grand sweep of history. Judah, on the other hand, is ruled by a single dynasty, a single family, the House of David. But it too, in the end, succumbs to foreign invasion a century and a half later in 586 BCE, when the Babylonians take over and carry off most of the prominent and wealthy Jews to Babylon. At this point, the Jews have lost their land, their nation, their monarchy, and their temple, all because, according to biblical historians, they have been unfaithful to the covenant. Things look very, very bleak. The idea there is that God will protect Israel, or Judah in this case, as long as they keep the commandments. And when they break those commandments, when they ignore God, when they turn to other deities, other gods, then they lose that protection from God, and then they're overcome by their enemies. These books seem to be the result of Jews looking back to their history and then trying to explain what went wrong. How did we end up where we are now? The prophets section of the Tanakh continues with the writings of the later prophets, the latter prophets, all of whom spell out in detail what was expected of the Israelites by God and where they fell short. It begins with the 8th century BCE prophet Isaiah, though the book now ascribed to him appears to have been written by several individuals over the course of a couple of centuries. We also see Jeremiah, who was writing about the time of the fall of Judah, and Ezekiel, who wrote from Babylon during the exile. The 12 minor prophets that follow all have their say in roughly chronological order, from Hosea in the 8th century BCE to Malachi in the 5th. Frequently writing in poetic forms, the prophets combine condemnations of wickedness and idolatry with hope-filled promises of a national restoration, that God will not forget his wayward people, even in exile. In the prophets, we see the work of a number of writers and later editors trying to make sense of the political and social catastrophe of Jewish history. What went wrong? And how did we get here? What can we expect in the future? The historian Robert Seltzer has memorably described this part of the Bible as a national epic of self-criticism. Since the 1940s, scholars have referred to the sequence of books from Josiah to Kings as the Deuteronomistic history, since they narrate the story of the Israelites using the language and theology of the book of Deuteronomy. That is to say, Israel's idolatry and oppression of the poor and the vulnerable and the general disregard of God's commandments brought upon them the curses pronounced by Moses at Moab. God is faithful to his promises, even if Israel was not. The writings of the prophets reinforce this message. As Isaiah says, if you would only heed my commands, Isaiah is going to quote God here in this case. If only you would heed my commands, Then your prosperity would be like a river, your triumph like the waves of the sea. Isaiah is speaking at a time when this has most surely not been the case. Israel is not at a time of triumph. Nevertheless, the prophets hold out hope that God will still have mercy on his people, that someday he will gather them together again and usher in the messianic age of peace, goodwill, and prosperity. It's striking that the Jews believed that God's personality and will could be ascertained through the study of history. And this perspective continued with Christians and Muslims. All three religious traditions looked toward records of the past to understand God and who he was and his relationships with human beings. By contrast, there was never quite the same emphasis in India on the accurate recordings of the reigns of specific kings. And as a result, the history of early India is much more difficult to recover. I guess if your basic understanding of the world is samsara, do you remember reincarnation, where everything happens again and again, the details of who did what when are perhaps less significant. If the prophets section tends to be focused on the political and religious history of Israel, the writings are more diverse and more broad-reaching. They include the stories of Job and Ruth, who were foreigners rather than Hebrews. It includes the book of Proverbs, which offers universal wisdom that crosses religious and ethnic boundaries. For example, a favorite proverb of mine is, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger." Okay, that's a kind of truth that might be applicable in many times, in many places. In fact, some of the proverbs that appear in the Hebrew book of Proverbs were originally borrowed from an Egyptian collection of aphorisms called the book of Amenemope. And then there are books that seem to break the rules. The Song of Songs, for example, is erotic love poetry, sometimes rather explicit, that's often been interpreted metaphorically, sort of like the stories of Krishna and the cowherds in the Hindu Puranas. The author of Ecclesiastes, another book, wonders if life in the end isn't just pointless, which seems to go against a lot of what the Bible says. And after the famous tale of the lion's den, the book of Daniel veers into strange apocalyptic prophecies of the end of times. The book of Esther tells of a courageous young Jewish woman living at a time when Jews were a vulnerable minority who saves her people by marrying a Gentile king, which is a little strange because that goes against some other commandments in the Hebrew Bible about not marrying, commandments not to marry Gentiles. And even more notoriously, in the book of Esther, God is never mentioned. This apparently bothered some people in antiquity. The Greek version of Esther in the Septuagint has added 6 sections of more than 100 verses that give the story a much more religious cast, with prayers and references to ritual purity and more than 50 invocations of God's name. The Psalms praise God and his creation, yet they also regularly express frustration and bewilderment at his inaction. The psalmist says, "I've tried to be true to you, O Lord, like why are my enemies prospering?" And then the book of Job offers one of the most powerful theological explorations in world literature, which tackles head-on the difficult question of why, if God is watching over all, the righteous so often suffer while the evil prosper. The Hebrew Bible is a sacred text in conversation with itself, sometimes even arguing with itself. And it's a striking reminder that religious faith is not necessarily opposed to doubt and questioning. Indeed, another take on the challenge of how different religions and cultures can get along with each other is the Hebrew Bible's implicit suggestion that one should be wary of people who claim to have all the answers, sort of like Job's friends. We'll be talking about them in just a few minutes. Things are rarely so simple, and sometimes all it takes is a closer look at the scriptures themselves. The Tanakh may be a closed canon, but the reticence of biblical narratives and the multiplicity of perspectives within the Tanakh can lead to deeper analysis, to more fervent seeking, and to endless discussions. For example, Chronicles is a reworking of the books of Samuel and Kings from a different theological viewpoint. And as we'll see in a later lecture, the Talmud is full of vigorous, faithful disputations about the meaning of the Tanakh. The writings conclude with some historical books, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, and these books narrate the story of Israel a little further after the exile, down to about 400 BCE. In this way, the Tanakh ends on a note of hope, with the last verses of Chronicles, in which the Persian king Cyrus fulfills a prophecy of Jeremiah long before by charging the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So that's sort of the end of the Hebrew Bible, is the Jews are commanded by Cyrus to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. By contrast, the Christian Old Testament places Chronicles after Kings with the other historical books, and it puts all of the prophets together, thus ending with a very different sort of hope. That is, with the book of Malachi, and with Malachi's prophecy of the return of the prophet Elijah, which early Christians associated with John the Baptist. Obviously, there's a great deal of material here, written over many centuries and incorporating different genres and perspectives. Still, we can ask whether there are any themes that bring all of this together. I'm going to suggest 4 themes, and I'm going to provide illustrative examples of each. The first theme is ethical monotheism. In the last lecture, I introduced that concept, which was a radical idea in the ancient world. The idea that there was one God, and that God cared about how people treated their neighbors. In the prophets, however, the notion of that single God gets even more emphatic. References in the Torah might be seen as henotheism, which is a term popularized by our old friend Max Mueller. That is, the worship of a single God while accepting the existence of other deities. So that's to say that there are many gods, but Israel should only worship Yahweh, even if other nations have their own gods. Isaiah, however, stresses that there's in actuality only one God in the whole universe, and that any others are just fakes or figments of human imagination. This one universal God cares not just about receiving offerings of meat and grain in a sort of, you give sacrifices to me and I'll bless you, in that sort of a quid pro quo arrangement, but this one God cares about how we treat each other, and in particular, the most vulnerable among us, the poor and the defenseless. There are elements of social justice in most major religions, in Hinduism and Buddhism and Christianity and Islam, but the declarations of the prophets in the Tanakh are particularly powerful. Take, for example, Amos, who's an early prophet, a native of Judah, who denounced injustice in the northern kingdom of Israel in the early 8th century BCE. In fact, he's one of the earliest of the writing prophets. Reporting the words of God, who speaks in Hebraic poetic couplets, Amos writes, this is God's words now, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But, and then here's the key point, this is what God really wants, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. You may remember that analogy. It was used by Martin Luther King in his famous I Have a Dream speech. And this emphasis on economic and social justice continues through the last of the prophets, Malachi, who says, also quoting God, "So I will come to put you on trial. I will be quick to testify against sorcerers, adulterers, and perjurers, against those who defraud laborers of their wages, who oppress the widows and the fatherless, and deprive the foreigners among you of justice, but do not fear me, says the Lord Almighty." One other thing that I like about this ethical monotheism is it's social justice not just for human beings, but also for animals. In those 613 commandments, there's a requirement that if you have an ox who is harnessed to a mill, to a grindstone, who walks around all day long in a circle, you're not allowed to muzzle that ox. So the ox every so often can put its head down and pick up some of the grain that's fallen on the floor. A God that cares about animals as well as human beings is a remarkable God in the ancient world. The second theme that I want to talk about is the mission and destiny of Israel. At first, Yahweh seems like a tribal God, concerned mostly with his own people. And the former prophets, remember all those historical books from Joshua through Kings, The former prophets constitute a national history. Why should people who are not Jewish care about that national tribal history? But the prophets once again expand that vision and argue that even though God has his chosen people, that people have been chosen as a means to bless the entire world. But Isaiah says it better in the second of the 4 servant songs that appear in his book. There are disputes about who exactly this servant might be. Some people say maybe Isaiah or Moses or Cyrus the Great or Jesus. But in Isaiah 49, the servant is explicitly the people of Israel. It says there, "And he said to me, 'You are my servant, Israel, in whom I glory.' I thought, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for empty breath. But my case rested with the Lord. My recompense was in the hands of my God. For he has said, 'It is too little that you should be my servant, in that I raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the survivors of Israel. I will also make you a light of the nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth.'" Okay, the idea there is that Israel has a special relationship with God, and that relationship includes being appointed by God as a light to the nations. An argument could be made that the Jews have indeed elevated the understanding and thought of the entire world. Take, for example, the number of Nobel Prize winners. Since 1901, these prestigious annual awards have recognized the greatest achievements in physics, chemistry, physiology, or medicine, literature, and peace. And beginning in 1969, prizes have also been given in economics. Over 20% of Nobel Prizes have gone to Jews, even though they make up only about 1/5 of 1% of the world's population. Okay, that's sort of amazing. 20% goes to 1/5 of 1% of the world's population. It's not my job here to evaluate religious claims, to say who's right and who's wrong, but objectively, from a strictly historical perspective, that's remarkable. It might be taken as empirical evidence of God's favor, or at the very least, this could be seen as the result of a people believing that they had a special mission, one that put a premium on intellectual ability and accomplishment. God's faithfulness and loving kindness is my third theme that I'm drawing out of the writings in the prophets. There are plenty of places in the Hebrew Bible that might make modern readers wince, where God seems like a vengeful destroyer of the wicked. Yet it's also clear that God is a compassionate, merciful deity, a loving father figure who enters into a covenantal relations with his children and who has their best interests at heart, even when they don't reciprocate his devotion. Another early prophet, Hosea, captures this idea in a beautiful verse where God speaks of Israel like a parent might speak of a toddler. God says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more I called them, the more they went away from me. But they kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with the cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and fed them." Just a lovely image of picking up a toddler and sort of being cheek to cheek there. My fourth theme is a deep sense of humanity. The Hebrew Bible includes some of the world's great literature, works that keenly observe human relationships and hearts, as we saw in the last lecture with the story of Joseph. So far, my examples have been from the prophets, but I want to conclude with 2 books from the writings that are nearly opposite from each other in form and style. The book of Job is a lengthy philosophical examination in poetry of one of the most difficult questions in religion. If God is loving and powerful, why do bad things happen to good people? On the other end of the spectrum is the book of Ruth, a tale of kindness and grace that's short, simple, and yet profoundly moving. It's not clear when the story of Job is supposed to have happened, but Job himself was a non-Israelite who nevertheless worshiped the Hebrew God and who is described as blameless and upright in every way. The book begins with 2 chapters of prose in which we learn how Job's children, his possessions, and his health are all suddenly taken away from him at the behest of Satan. Okay, Satan in the book of Job is not exactly the later Christian devil. In the Hebrew Bible, Satan, which means the accuser, is a member of the divine council and works for God, sort of like his prosecutor or a spy that he has. After those first 2 chapters that set up the situation, there comes 36 chapters of poetry in which Job's friends arrive at his home to console him. But they're not very effective. They're actually not all that great of friends. They've accepted the theology of Deuteronomy, right? This is the notion that God blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked. And since they see what looks like punishment in the case of Job, they argue that he must have sinned. Job pushes back against this assumption, declaring his innocence and even challenging God to meet him in court so that he can argue his case. I'm not sure that's a great idea. And finally, God himself speaks out of a whirlwind. But he doesn't give any explanations. And he certainly doesn't talk about how he gave Satan permission to tempt Job. Instead, God reminds Job just who exactly he is dealing with. God asks, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" Meaning Job. "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." And then there's a whole lot more similar questions. These are rhetorical questions that sort of point out the difference between God and human beings and his infinite knowledge as opposed to limited human perspectives and understanding. In the end, Job acknowledges that his understanding is quite limited compared to God's power and majesty. Even if clear-cut answers are not forthcoming for all of our doubts and concerns, it still makes sense to trust in God, according to the book of Job. In contrast with the difficult, magnificent poetry of Job, the book of Ruth tells a simple story of ordinary villagers long ago in just 85 verses. It begins with a series of untimely deaths that leaves Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law widowed in the land of Moab, so all 3 widows living together. Naomi, who is an Israelite, wants to return to her homeland, and she urges her daughters-in-law to stay in their native land and marry again. But Ruth refuses, telling Naomi, "Where you go, I will go. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God." It's a brave, noble gesture, but the 2 women still have no food, no means of support. The law of Moses allowed the destitute to follow behind harvesters and pick up what had been overlooked or dropped. Ruth does this in a field and so meets Boaz, a kindly older farmer who had heard of her self-sacrifice on Naomi's behalf. There's some complications along the way, having to do with a near kinsman who had a legal responsibility to marry Ruth, but then decided against it because he didn't want to complicate his family or jeopardize the inheritances of his children by taking a new wife who might have additional children, etc. And so the way was cleared for Ruth and Boaz to wed and to have children. Eventually, this Moabite woman, Ruth, became one of the ancestors of David and of the royal line of Judah. It's a lovely story in which terrible misfortunes are overcome and barriers of nationality and ethnicity and class and generations are transcended, all through kindness. But the real attraction of the narrative is in the details that have been analyzed and discussed for more than 2,000 years. Here's how the novelist Cynthia Ozick describes the nearest cautious kinsman. She says, "He has only the usual order of courage. He avoids risk. He thinks of what he has, not of what he might do." Boaz, on the other hand, does have the strength of imagination to start a new life that he couldn't have dreamed of when he first heard of the impoverished young foreigner out gleaning in his fields. And it all leads to a new beginning. And the beginning, of course, is a baby, according to Cynthia Ozick. It's hard to express what I feel when I reread these words today. I first came across them many years ago when my wife read Ozick's essay. At that time, we had just been asked, very unexpectedly, if we would consider adopting a baby who was due to be born in a month or so. At first, we wavered. It would be a tremendous responsibility with a lot of unknowns, and we felt like we were a happy family already. But we read this essay about Ruth and decided that we too would follow Boaz and take the path of courage and kindness, thinking not of what we already had, but of what we might do. The boy that entered our family shortly thereafter, the baby boy, has been one of the great blessings of our lives. You never know what might happen if you start reading sacred texts seriously.